What's up, everybody? So it's time for another guide, and for this week, we're talking about trade. Trade is a really weird topic in EU4, because while it's not actually that difficult to understand, it is quite varied. There's a lot of different topics that need to be covered, some of which have nothing to do with each other, so it makes it more confusing unless you break it down by the sections. So that's what I'm going to be doing, so I apologize if this seems chaotic, because it is going through multiple different topics that have nothing to do with one another other than the fact that it goes all under one umbrella of trade. So let's go ahead and get started. The easiest way to explain trade in this game is just to go and start from the general concept of what's happening and then delve deeper into each facet. So the first thing to talk about is just what trade is. Trade is every province has some good it creates. In this province, they are producing grain. That grain is valued at 2.5 ducats for every grain that is produced, and they produce so much grain based off of their development. Now, one of two things happens. Either the people that control the Kiev node, where they are based out of, this province is located, either they're going to collect all the money that is created there, all the goods that are created there get sold there, in which case they will divide the income based off of their trade power percentage, and that's it. Anything that is not collected there, however, flows out of the node either along this trade wind or this trade wind. Just look for the arrows that are flowing out of it. And then it goes to the next trade node, where other people will have some trade power. And they get to decide whether they collect or if they keep pushing it on as well. Now, eventually you will reach an end node. These are the English Channel, Genoa, or Venice, where they must be sold. There is no further pushing from this node. It must be collected, period, the end. And it's going to, again, be based off of what the trade power distribution is on who gets the value of this good. So, grain produced all the way over here in Kiev, if it's not collected, will flow north to Novgorod, then to the Baltic Sea, then to Lubeck, and then to the English Channel, where it'll be collected, and the English will get half the value of this grain that's produced all the way over here in Kiev. That's the basic concept. Now, let's go ahead and start delving into how these mechanics work, because each one of them is going to be important to understand how to maximize your income, and we're going to be looking at it from Lubeck's perspective. The first of these mechanics we're going to talk about is trade power, because there can be 20,000 ducats here in Lubeck. If you don't have any trade power there, you're getting nothing. Trade power is what determines who gets the share of whatever the value happens to be, and it's all in relation to one another. So this says I have 17% of the total trade value, and then you have the trade power numbers, the absolute numbers down here below. See, as Lubeck, I have 74 trade power. Denmark has 91. When you take that in comparison with everybody else that's there, I get 17%, they get 22. Now, where is this coming from? Well, you get a flat amount from having a merchant in the area, which is why England, it says 2 here. It's just because they have a merchant present. But the rest of it's largely coming from your provinces or your light ships. Now, provinces, you get 0.2 trade power for every 1 development in a trade node. So because this is 17 development in Lubeck itself, it is worth 3.4 trade value. Period. You just get 3.4 trade power for this one province. Now you get it for other things as well, like as a center of trade, level 2, you get 10 in there, so this is why it matters so much, because that is a lot of development to get to that 10 trade power. You also have an entrepot here modifier, which is completely separate, which gives you another 10. Now you can actually modify these a little bit using buildings such as a marketplace, which will increase it by a percentage, but you can also expand infrastructure. This will expand it by an extra 5%, and that does apply to the center of trade, the entrepot, the development. All of that does stack onto it. Now, the other side of it is light ships. Light ship, every one of them at the start of the game gives you 2 trade power. In other words, every one light ship is worth 10 development, which is why they're so vital for you to dominate a trade node, because you're going to have a lot of development in order to fight off even a small fleet of light ships. And this only gets worse as it goes on. See, a caravel is worth 2.5. I believe an early frigate is worth 3 or 4, and it keeps going up as tech progresses through the game. So you need to make sure your light ships are being upgraded, but if you don't have light ships, you're missing out on a huge amount of income. Now, the last thing that's in here, you have light ships and merchants, provinces, and then you have modifiers. You get 10% of a bonus for every node that is transferring into the node itself. So because I have a merchant in the North Sea and in Saxony and in the Baltic Sea, which are all feeding into Lübeck, I'm getting 30% on top of that. And then you also get a little bit for prestige and a little bit for power projection. So if you keep those high, you will have more trade power in the nodes that you are in, allowing you to collect more trade value because you have a greater share. The last thing I want to point out is that there is a mechanic in here that will impact your provincial trade power, and that is mercantilism. For every 1% of mercantilism, it increases the provincial trade power by 2%. So by having 3.4 just in this province for development, by having 25% in there, it's increasing it by 50% in the math, meaning I have an extra 1.7 in there. It's not huge, but when you're adding up a lot of these buildings and a lot of these entrepots and centers of trade, you're going to start noticing that there's a lot of trade power that can be multiplied that way. So mercantilism does matter if you're using a lot of your provinces to try and maintain control over certain nodes. But light ships, of course, are completely separate. But that is trade power in a nutshell. Let's now turn to trade efficiency. Trade efficiency is a pretty easy concept to understand, which is why I kind of wanted to just get it out of the way. All trade efficiency is, it's a bonus on what you're collecting in tax income. As you can see right here, it's saying last month Lübeck made 4.55 ducats off of trade. What it's going to do is it's going to figure out what the income is just from trade before the modifier and give you this percentage of that amount as a bonus. So if it was, say, 5 ducats, I would make 17% of that 5 ducats in addition to the 5 ducats as a bonus. Now, this is capped at 200%. So if it was capped at 200% and I made 5 ducats in trade income, I'd get a 10 ducat bonus, just as a flat bonus to my income. So you want to have trade efficiency as high as possible, especially if you're going as a trade empire, because it does really increase the value if you've already had a high number to begin with. But it's not going to matter too much if you're not pushing into trade heavily. Now that that's kind of out of the way, let's start talking about goods produced and value, and that's really where it starts to get complicated, and I tend to lose people. So let's just dive right in. In order to understand trade value, we have to go back to the province. You see, every province is going to produce some trade good. So in Lübeck, that's naval supplies. In Prignitz, that's livestock. Down here in Potsdam, that's wool, etc. Now, naval supplies is valued at 2 ducats for every 1 goods produced. And you can see here that it's producing 1.4 of these goods per month. Why is it 1.4? Because you get 0.2 for every 1 diplomatic development in that province. Administrative and military development do not give you goods produced. Only diplomatic development does. Because there's 7 here, that means it's 1.4. Now you can get more goods produced from a couple of other factors. First of which, you have manufactories, which will give a flat +1 goods produced, so it's worth 5 diplomatic development. You also get 5% more goods produced in every province for every furnace that you build later in the game. And then you get for right here with expand infrastructure, you will also increase the goods produced by 5% if you do that in the province. So there is a number of ways to slightly increase the amount of goods produced. But there is another. Specifically, if it is a province that is in the same node as a merchant republic, a trade company, or a trade port, they get a bonus to goods produced so long as they are not also in that merchant republic, trade company, or a trading city. So because Mecklenburg is not controlled by Lübeck, but they are in the same node as Lübeck, they get bonus goods produced. And the amount of goods produced is going to be dependent on, you guessed it, the amount of trade power percentage they have in that node. So because Lübeck has a 17% value there, when you look here at Weimar, they're getting a 8.9% boost to their goods produced. And then that will flow into the node, and then if Lübeck controls the node, they'll get all the money from that. This is the idea. You want to have, as a merchant republic or a trade company, all of the trade power there with as many provinces not in it as possible to spike goods produced. And I'll talk a bit more about trade companies and the things you should do there later on. But as you can see here, you want to have more goods produced because that creates more of these goods, which will be going into the trade node and increasing the value that's in that node, which is then split based off of trade power. Hopefully that all makes sense. If you need to, just watch it again. It really shouldn't be that complicated to understand basic ideas of goods produced. Now let's talk about how you make money off of trade, because all of this is pretty simplistic, and you make that amount of money through production as well, just by owning the province and making all these goods. So how do you make money off of trade where you can make some truly obscene numbers? It all comes down to trade steering. Trade steering is one of those concepts that tends to cause a lot of confusion because it's doing two very different things. The first of which is dictating where trade value is going when you're using a merchant to transfer it to another node. As you can see here, you do have the option of selecting which upstream node the North Sea flows into. If you didn't have a merchant here, it just goes based off of whatever everybody else decides. But because I have a merchant here telling it to push it to Lübeck, it is using my trade power in the calculation to decide how much is going to Lübeck. So for example, England obviously wants to push it to the English Channel where it controls trade, as opposed to going to Lübeck where it does not. So it's going to look at their trade power value versus my trade power value and push 5 times more of the value to the English Channel than it is to Lübeck, because that's the difference in trade power. Now, here's the thing. I have 42% trade steering. So my trade power is going to be increased by 42%, which will make it so there's more heading towards Lübeck than normal because I have increased trade steering. Now, the other thing it does is it actually increases the value of what is being transferred over. Because every time some value gets transferred from one node into another, it increases in value based off of how many merchants are transferring it. It is not a simple straight up, since it's moving over, it automatically increases in value. It's going to increase by a set percentage based off of how many merchants are pushing it. And this is whole different math, so give me 1 second while I bring up the math. This is the math for trade steering, and I know this is a lot of numbers and math all being thrown in your face at once, but give me a second and I will explain why all of this makes sense. You see, on the left, you'll see merchants up to 5, and they each provide a bonus. Now, this is the value that is getting steered out of that node. So anything that's being collected is not being increased, but anything that transfers out is being increased in value based off of how many merchants are present and how much their trade steering happens to be. Now, the first merchant is going to be worth 5%, just as a base amount. The second one is going to increase it by another 2.5, 1.6, 1.2, and 1.0. In other words, you get a maximum of 5 merchants that will increase the value of the trade that is being transferred from one node to another. So the maximum amount you can get is 11.3. Now, this is based, however, on the base amount. If, however, you have increased trade steering, these percentages go up based off of tag order, and I will get to that in a second. But the rest of this is the math on how that works out. So the top bit of math is what happens if it's just 3 trade values. So 1 cloth that is being bounced from node to node to node. Now, if there was only 1 merchant and it bounces 1 node, that 3 ducats is multiplied to 3.15. If it makes it all the way through 5 nodes with only 1 merchant transferring, though, it's worth 3.83. If all 5 are there, it's worth 5.12. But if you add a little bit of trade steering, which I just wanted to point out is actually in trade ideas, the 25% is right here. So if you go through trade ideas, you would be able to, give me 1 second, the one merchant with no one else there, if you go through 5 nodes, that 3 ducats is now worth 11.68. And if you have 5 merchants, all who unlock trade ideas, it's worth 13.92. So obviously you want to have more merchants for more money. But having more trade steering means a lot more. And the reason why is because it goes by tag order. Now, the second equation is if it's 500 ducats, it's all the same in terms of how much it drastically increases. But as you can see, you could make a lot of money doing this. So what's the key? What's the issue? It's because it goes by tag order. In other words, the first merchant that is there will be 5%. So if they have 25% trade steering, they are increasing it by an extra 1.25%, making it the first merchant 6.25, and then the next one's 2.5, etc. If you're the last merchant, number 5, you're only increasing it by 0.25%. So where you fall in the tag order matters. And this is a part of that tag order calculation. As you can see, Sweden is going to be number 1. They're always going to be the first one that's really being calculated other than pirates. They're just going to be the first one being calculated. So trade steering is huge for Sweden and Denmark and Finland and Gotland and whoever it happens to be in the Scandinavian area. Then you have the people like Estonia. Eventually you get to Byzantium. But people like, say, the Mamluks, whose number 300 will likely never actually appear in the trade steering calculation. Because they are so far down the list, they're too far gone, it's not going to help. Now, if you look in here, I believe Lübeck is on this list that you can see, but they're still nowhere close to being early. So keep that in mind, because either you're going to have to eliminate a lot of other tags to make certain your trade steering is actually mattering, or it might be better suited for you to simply not go with it. And I will point out the last tag on this list, before you get to colonial nations that spawn randomly, is Israel. Don't know why they decided to make Israel last, other than the fact they're a new tag, but this is how it is. But if you look at how this works, if you're trying to create a trade empire, it's better for you to be Haiti than it is for you to be the United States. It's better for you to be Naxos than it is for you to be England. Why? Don't know. This is simply how they did it. So again, use this math so that you can get the merchants in the area to increase your trade power. But if you're saying 5 merchants already present that are already pushing the trade power somewhere else, and you're towards the end of this tag order, it might be worth it just to send your merchants somewhere else, because it's generally not going to be doing a whole lot, especially if they're all transferring it in the same direction that you'll be transferring it, because it's all going to the same place anyway, and you'll collect it later. Because if you're not getting the bonus, then what's the point? But that is how you make a ton of money, is through trade steering, and that's it in a nutshell. Let's now turn to a couple of other topics. One of these other topics is going to be inland nodes. You see, you have these inland, non-sea connected trade nodes like Saxony, Rhineland, Champagne, Vienne. All of these do not have any kind of sea access. Well, if you look at these nodes, you're going to notice that there are some tags inside of them that have something called caravan power. What this is it takes their total development in that node and divides it by 3. They get a maximum of 50 trade power in that node simply because it relies on caravans. The idea of this is to help prevent people from losing all their trade power from having propagation coming from these sea tiles, because these sea tiles have light ships, and the way the propagation works is you get, I don't remember the percentage, but you get a part of whatever the trade power is that you have in this node flowing back into these nodes. So because you can have light ships with just tons and tons and tons of trade power floating around, this is to help counteract those light ships and prevent you from stealing everything constantly just because you can have a light ship fleet, whereas Bohemia, being landlocked, cannot. The next thing to talk about is simple embargoes. This is right here. If you issue an embargo, basically they'll get an opinion malice against you, they'll get a war goal against you, but what happens is in any node that you share trade power in. So for example, in Lubeck, where you have 74 and they have 37, the defender loses trade power worth half of the attacker's trade power in that node. So for example, if I embargoed England, since I have 74, half of that would be about 37, meaning they'd only have 0.5 trade power left in the Lubeck node if I embargoed them. In the North Sea, where I only have 11.5, they'd lose instead about 6 trade power, which isn't huge, but it's enough. And it'll help reduce England's income because it reduces their presence in all of these nodes by whatever my trade power is. This means that you can use light ships offensively to, say, push them in here and get however much trade power you can, and then embargo England on top of that to help reduce the amount of trade power they have in competition with your light ships. Now, if you are not a rival of somebody, you lose 5% trade efficiency. So you can't do this to everybody. But if you're trying to take control over, say, the English Channel, it might be worth embargoing them just to send light ships there, because that helps not only push your value up, but drag their value down, giving you a higher percentage than you would otherwise, which might be worth the 5% trade efficiency, especially if you're already above the 200 trade efficiency cap, though that can be somewhat difficult to accomplish. Do keep in mind that mercantilism increases embargo efficiency. So if you're at 100 mercantilism, instead of it dropping it by half, you get the full value of your trade power as a negative off of theirs. So with my 10 light ships, that would be 20 trade power, which I can send to the English Channel, which would drop it by 20 and make it so I have probably not a huge amount, but 10% of everything in that node, which might be worth it. So try and keep that calculation in the back of your head, because for the most part, most people say mercantilism sucks, and it kind of does, but it is very useful for embargo efficiency when you're messing with somebody like England that relies heavily on their trade income. One of the things that you can do with your light ships is set them to steal from a trade node through privateering. What privateering does is it takes those trade ships and their trade value and puts them in a node. So in this case, 10 trade ships would be 20 trade power, and that would be about 5% in the English Channel. But what would happen is they give you half the value of whatever they're stealing. So you'd actually get about 2.5% of the value in the English Channel. Now, it would make everybody mad that you're doing it, but you can do that if you want to mess with people. But obviously, if you have a free merchant, it might be better for you just to send them to protect trade and collect from that, because then you're getting more money. And this is why you do not do it in any node that you actually control, because it tends to not be worth it. Where it does happen to be worth it is where treasure ships come through. In the New World, you will find gold mines, such as in Mexico or Brazil. And what happens is they don't just simply go to their overlords, they are sent as treasure ships through the nodes. When a treasure ship hits, say, Sevilla here, if there are pirates, portion of the gold value of those treasure ships, let's say 5%, is taken, and half of it is given just in straight ducats to the overlord that sent them. So that is when it is worth it. It's when you have no power in the node, so you can't protect ships there. You have no merchant to try and take it over. Or if a treasure ship is going to be flowing through that node because you're going to be stealing the gold from it. That is when you privateer. Now let's turn to trade companies, because I see a lot of people ask what they should be trade companying and what they should not. So let's talk about that. And welcome back, everybody. So as you can see, I am Castile, and I've taken over southern India, with which I could use to show you guys trade companies. Before I do, though, I did want to point out one very quick thing. As you can see under goods produced, I do lose 20% of my goods produced ability simply through intolerance, which is right here. Because they are technically heathen, I do lose 20% because you lose 10% for every one intolerance. So if they were a heretic province, I'd lose 10%. The way you can handle this is, of course, by taking humanist ideas, and the reason why is because that will give you not only this right here, which is +2 to the tolerance, which will just completely neutralize the penalty, but then you can also increase the maximum tolerance that you have of them to help reduce unrest in general. And then, of course, you also have goods produced just in the trade company ideas, etc., just to boost it that way. And then finally, if you are a Christian, you do have one of the golden bulls in here that allow you to have +2 tolerance to heathens, and that will help counteract this as well. So that's just something to keep in mind. Now let's talk about trade companies themselves. So as I said before, you do get a bonus to your goods produced by being within the general area of a merchant republic, a trade company, or a trade city. Now, in order to best take advantage of this, what you're going to do is you're going to take any province that has a lot of trade power. Usually those are going to be ones like right here, where you have an estuary or a center of trade, and those are going to be the ones you're going to focus on putting into trade companies. The reason why is because you only get the bonus to goods produced if they are in the same trade node as a trade company. However, only if they're not in the trade company itself. So as you can see, it is now 8%, but these provinces that are in it do not get that bonus goods produced because they are in the actual trade company. So you need to find ways to give as much trade power as possible to the trade company with as few provinces as possible, because the 8% amount is based entirely on the amount of trade power that they have in the trade company, not based off of anything else. So it's by going through here and just adding a few of them, you'll notice that it will go up, give me 1 second, from 8%, and now since it's more trade power in the trade company, sorry, events kind of slow it down. It now goes to 11.9 because I've increased them, but if I add all of them and increase all of them, give me 1 second while I do this. And welcome back. So I just added all of these centers of trade, and I upgraded the ones that I actually could upgrade without any development. And as you can see, the goods produced is now increased by 17.5%. And the reason why is you get half of whatever the trade value is in terms of trade power in that node that is part of the trade company. Since I added only these provinces with centers of trade and nothing else, that is what's going on with that. And then you also get some boosted production if you're the production leader of a specific trade good, in this case cloth. So I get a lot more out of my cloth provinces just because of that. So if you want to have the most you can out of this, make sure you build the appropriate buildings in your centers of trade. So in this case it would be stock exchanges. In these centers of trade area, develop them, keep them in a high development area. Everything else, do not build any stock exchanges. Don't build anything for trade. Build a manufactory, build production, that's fine. And then just keep them low in trade power so you can have as much of a boost in goods produced as possible, because that way you have more money to go into your equation for the trade steering, which will make you just tons and tons and tons of money. And for every trade node that you have over 50% of the trade power in that node in a trade company, then you get an extra merchant to put in that node to then make you more money. Lastly, if you are collecting in any node with a merchant, you get automatically 10% bonus trade efficiency. So you'll make more money by having a merchant there. So even if you are, say, England or Venice or Genoa, and you're already controlling these nodes 100%, it is still worthwhile to put a merchant in those nodes because it will give you an extra 10% of whatever the value is. And again, once you're doing enough trade steering, that 10% could be hundreds of ducats. But that's really what you guys need to know to basically understand how trade is working in this game. Take control of a node, use that to get enough trade power to own the node, even if you don't necessarily own all the provinces. So at least you're getting all the money that's flowing in, and then use trade ships to pull it from other places. As far as just general advice on when to collect, when to transfer, do not transfer your trade into any node that you do not at least control 80% of. Because if you're transferring something you own 80% into something you only own 50%, you're losing money and you're giving it to somebody else for no reason. Just collect where you can, and then if you're able to transfer it into another node where you own 80%, then it is viable. Otherwise, just collect in both. If you do not have the ability to get into an end node like the English Channel very easily, but you're Lubeck, it is still worthwhile to backfill and then use light ships to dominate Lubeck so England isn't pulling anything out of Lubeck, allowing you to end the trade in Lubeck. If you can't do that for whatever reason, such as England or Lubeck itself being just too much of a trade power, give a firewall between your main node and their node, such as if I am Russia, I will control as much of the Baltic node as possible, and I will still collect everything in Novgorod, because they can't pull anything out of Novgorod unless they have at least some dominance in the Baltic node, and that helps me prevent people from stealing my money. But that's generally what you guys need to know. Trade is actually pretty self-understanding, and it's pretty intuitive once you understand the basic mechanics. But this is why it might be viable for you to leave some of these smaller tags in Africa available, to keep their merchants available, to use them for more trade steering, because just having them present might be worth 2.5% extra, even if they have no real trade power value. So keeping them alive as, say, Timbuka makes it so they don't really have the ability to challenge you or take your money, but it might increase the value of your trade. So with all that being said, that's what you guys need to know. I hope you guys have found this entertaining and educational. But thank you guys for watching, and I hope you all have a wonderful week.